Greetings and welcome everyone to this week's Building Power Grassroots Education Advocacy. I'm your host, Zakiya Jabbar. I'm glad to have y'all with us today. Just some housekeeping. Make sure that you hit the thumbs up button and share this broadcast. We want to, have hopefully a lively discussion in the comments. And if you have any questions, we'll try to get to those as well before we wrap up. But today, I'm looking forward to having this conversation with Brother Chris Scott about his work convening the Federal School Discipline Coalition. Chris, what's up? Introduce yourself to our audience.
Hey, Zakiya, thanks for having me. So for folks that don't know me, I am Chris Scott. I'm a senior policy advisor for Open Society Foundation's Open Society Policy Center. I'm also the co-founder and co-convener of the Federal School Discipline and Climate Coalition, also known as FED-SDC. For OSF, I work on a range of issues from education to policing, criminal justice reform, youth justice, youth reentry, and then reentry writ large. And for FED-SDC, it's really helping to create a coalition that is accountable to communities and individuals on the ground, centering both race and then directly impacted and formerly, incarcerated individuals. But we also play a unique role in terms of the federal work that we do, at the federal level in terms of advocating and lobbying on policy, but also working with the administration or challenging the administration on a number of policies, funding programs, et cetera, that are problematic and harmful to Black and Brown communities. I think the biggest thing that we really do, and what I try to do in my work, is to make sure that we are not negotiating on the backs of Black and Brown communities, individuals, students, youth, and children. And so that's just, what we do on a day-to-day basis and how we typically approach this work when we're talking about what it means to address educational inequities or deal with some of the systemic issues and causes of both racism and harmful things that happen to Black and Brown children in schools. So, and I want to just, take this moment to thank Zakiya for having me on and looking forward to this conversation.
Yes, sir. This is a very, very important conversation. And just want to remind folks to hit the thumbs up button. Make sure you share this. It's going to be a really good conversation. It's also critical to those of us who want to be civically engaged, because what we're going to talk about today is something that the media has not really covered. But it's something that is extremely important, especially to those of us who are parents and have children in public or charter schools in this country. So, Chris, can you give us or give, the audience a kind of like a general overview of the Counseling Not Criminalization in Schools Act?
Yeah, so Counseling Not Criminalization in Schools Act, also known as CNC. The House bill is HR 4011 and the Senate bill is S2125. It's a bill that is, sponsored and authored by Senator Murphy, a Democrat from Connecticut in the Senate, and then Representative Ayanna Pressley, a Democrat from Massachusetts. This bill is important for a number of reasons. I think, one, it's the first time in my sort of 12, 15 years being on the Hill and being at the Department of Education or at the White House, and in this work where we have a bill that actively prohibits federal funding for going to law enforcement in schools, and then turns around and makes a $5 billion investment. You heard me correctly, a $5 billion investment in providing, resources and access to mental health professionals, counselors, alternatives to law enforcement, and other modes of alternatives to exclusionary school discipline policies, which includes suspensions, arrests, expulsions, referrals to court, referrals to law enforcement, and ticketing for families for truancy. And so this bill, in a number of different ways, sets it up for schools and districts that want to do the right thing and want to move away from the brutalization and victimization of Black and brown students, youth, and children in our nation's schools to actually do so and have the resources to do that. We understand now that even though Title I funding exists, it's not set up in a way that allows those schools who are trying to have culturally sustaining educational programming, positive school environments, and school climate that is, receptive and helpful to the safety of all students, not just white students, that there aren't the funding for it. You oftentimes have to choose between technology, between law enforcement in schools, or counselors, mental health professionals in order to get Title I funding. And most of the time, those funds get siphoned off as a priority for both the technology needs and resources and law enforcement in schools, because a lot of folks in schools and districts think that law enforcement equals safety. And we unequivocally know for Black and brown children, that is just not true. And the same is true for Black and brown communities for the most part. And so that's really the crux and the bulk of what the Counseling Not Criminalization in Schools Act does. It also sets up and defines what schools and districts can do with respects to, having mental health professionals and counselors in schools. And it's not, I should be clear, it is not something that is going to be rooted in the institutionalization of Black and brown students, youth, and children. It is something that is going to be, making sure that we have the right level of diversified mental health professionals and counselors who are Black and brown, who can relate to Black and brown students and understand what is needed, and do that in a way that is centering both race, but also equity within the field, so that we don't run into the continued use of mental health providers, mental health professionals, behavioral supports and needs being met with criminalization or institutionalization tools. So,
listen, brother, this is on time. This is on time. And I say that because, as you know, I live in Moco, Montgomery County, and my partner, and then also Carolyn, who was on staff with Racial Justice Now. Racial Justice Now is doing local work here in Montgomery County, and there was an unfortunate incident this week at Montgomery Blair High School. Racial Justice Now and a bunch of student groups successfully organized and won police-free schools starting this school year. And it was right on time for my son because he was going to ninth grade, going to high school. So this was deeply personal for me. I'm like, Lord, I cannot have no police officer nowhere near my son, while he's in school. School should be a safe haven for our children.
Yep.
And as you know, it was hard, but thankfully, we have some Will Jawando, who is amazing. He was the sponsor, and it literally started from a conversation. I know you know Will. He was in the Obama administration.
Yep.
He's on our county council now. Shout out to Will. He responded to an Instagram post. I'm like, will you help us get the police out of Montgomery County schools? He was just like, yes. And that was it. Like, I was like, okay. So we followed up, just kept the work going. So the first school district, we're one of the first school districts in this area. Alexandria, Virginia did it, but they turned around and put them right back. So they don't count. but Montgomery County, as of right now, still has police-free schools. But there are talks, as you can imagine, after the unfortunate the student was stabbed by another student outside on the campus of Montgomery Blair High School on Monday. And so we released a statement, and lots of our community folks, are really saddened by that. But one of the things that came up for me that you talked about was shifting those dollars to the things that actually create real safety in schools. And unfortunately, these schools started, and I'm talking about this from a parent. I have a high schooler and an elementary schooler.
Yep.
They started school like everything was normal. They didn't have no kind of like, let's just ease into the year. Let's make sure we got like mental health therapists on staff. The counselors are academic counselors. They're not mental health supports. And I was really perturbed by interim superintendent McKnight's email yesterday that she sent out to all the parents in MCPS community, just really hard nosed, lock them up and throw away the key type of message, threatening students, who, come, with these issues. And I'm just like, you need to take some responsibility. MCPS, the school board, needs to take some responsibility because money isn't an issue for this district. That's what's so wild, because so many Black children go to schools where underfunding is really an issue, right? Like the funding formula is, as you know, property taxes in a lot of places. So if you're in like these cities and they're landlocked around suburbs, the property taxes in a lot of inner cities obviously is not that of suburbs. So that's usually the case for our kids, but not here. There's no excuse for this district not to have what they need. And so that's why I appreciate the fact that you explained what this is at the federal level, this Counseling Not Criminalization in Schools Act. I want to come with another question for you, because I think this is probably questions that the people who are listening may have. What are some of the misconceptions people may have about this bill? What has it looked like in places that have already started to move towards this direction, like Minneapolis and Denver, in terms of like decriminalizing things and not using the police for everything?
Yeah. So I think the biggest misconception is that, this is going to create, not my words, but, folks on the other side, this is going to create, a bunch of criminals and thugs in our nation's schools. And I just think that that's unequivocally false, right? We know research has shown, the FBI knows this, and a number of other folks have shown this through their research, that law enforcement in schools is not going to make schools safer. It's not going to prevent an incident, a fight, or something tragically happening on a school. And in most cases, when we talk about it, school resource officers, schools, security officers or school security agents being in schools, it actually, for Black and brown students and students with disabilities and LGBTQ plus students, it makes it much more dangerous, because the power and authority in which law enforcement officers yield and how they use that in Black and brown schools is problematic. And then also how the policies are set up is even more problematic, because it provides them this sort of unilateral approach to dealing with minor school-based misbehavior in ways that results in criminalization, that results in, some kids getting maced, pepper sprayed, beaten, punched, slammed on their head, and abused in ways that, as a parent, you could never do to your child, or anyone else do to your child. And you would never want that to happen to your child. And so I think that's the biggest misconception that we face. The other misconception that we face is that Black and brown children and students with disabilities need law enforcement officers in schools, because it's not that the policies are racist. It's not that there is bias amongst, law enforcement in schools, or that the law enforcement profession is racist. It's that those students are inherently bad. To which I throw my hands up and say, how is that not racist when you say that?
How is it not anti-Black and racist? Exactly.
Right. And it's the conversation that we have to have with folks, and explain that even in saying that, you are continuing these sort of racist tropes, and you are dehumanizing Black and brown students in ways that only views them as deficits rather than assets. And that's where the Counseling Not Criminalization bill comes in. That's where the mental health professionals, and that's when you talk about diversity and centering race and racial equity, that's where that comes into play. Because from a cultural perspective, you understand that some students may just be having a bad day. And to try to meet them with a level of resistance or authority is only going to escalate the situation rather than de-escalate it. And so there are things that we understand as a Black community, as a brown community, as parents, as real educators who are fighting these issues day in and day out. We understand what it looks like and what the alternatives are and what some of the solutions are to creating safe school environments, but also making sure that they are culturally responsive to the programming that's being provided to students. And I think that if we continue to ignore that, we are going to be in a place where we are, forgetting criminalizing and forgetting a whole generation of Black and brown students and students with disabilities and LGBTQ plus students, but then also removing them from their educational settings in ways that's not going to foster their development, that's going to continue to the 400 years of trauma that has been bestowed upon them and that continues, that they have to face day in and day out. And it's also going to violently disrupt, where they and how they see themselves in this society and in the world. And so I think for all those reasons, the education that we do through Fed SDC, that we do with our, coalition partners from the Alliance for Educational Justice, Communities for Just Schools Fund, Dignity in Schools Coalition, COPA, and National Women's Law Center, the Civil Disability Rights Network, and the Daniel Initiative. All those groups are instrumental in the work that we do at the federal level to not only educate members and staffers about this, but also push them in ways that stops this over-reliance on racist policies and practices, and actually, allows us to be accountable to the community, and meet the demands of the community and those on the front lines and those who are directly impacted. We're not sitting in the space where we are having conversations with folks that only look at this from an academic perspective and say, oh, this is a model, this is an assessment that we need to use. No, we're listening to those who are on the front lines and trying to initiate these members and their staff in ways where, not for us to sit at the table and have these conversations, but for parents, teachers, educators, young people, students, et cetera, to have a seat at the table and articulate to them what they actually experience, not what folks have read in some book or these stupid models that folks think are going to be helpful and are alternatives to law enforcement, such as threat assessments, when they actually end up doing the same thing and putting Black and brown children in categories that will continue to criminalize, brutalize, victimize, and violently dehumanize them in the same ways that we continue to be dehumanized. So
that's exactly right. I'm so glad you brought up the threat assessments, because Maryland is one of the states that actually has a state law on that. And I remember when it went into effect, and I was just like, damn, they just work so fast. Boy, they can pass a bill that's criminalizing these kids so fast, but then we want to go and talk to them about decriminalization. It takes 2, 3, 4, 5 sessions to get a law passed to do that. You know what I mean? It's really unfortunate. And we're seeing that, as you mentioned, black and brown students specifically continue to get caught up in this net, continue to get caught up in this criminalization net. And we can and should do better. And we need this right at the federal level, because there's just some states that are just not going to move on this, not going to move on decriminalizing this thing. So let me ask you this question, because you kind of touched on it. I want to give you an opportunity to really drill down on this. And I want to do some housekeeping really quickly again. Thanks so much for all of you who are watching. We appreciate you being here. Do us a favor, hit the like button and share this conversation. Feel free to post your comments about what you hear. Feel free to post questions about what you have for our guest, Chris Scott. And Chris Scott is with the Open Society Policy Center, right? Not the foundation.
So it's both. So it's Open Society Foundation and it's Open Society Policy Center. So
right. So we have a very capable expert here that's telling us about this bill that the Federal School Discipline Coalition, which he chairs and convenes, is working around. So my question, Chris, is what has this legislative battle been like thus far? Because it's definitely been a battle. I've been on a few of the calls and I know it's a lot. What can people do to put pressure, if they need to, on their congressional representatives into supporting this bill if they're not, and ensuring that we get it through?
Yes. So I think, so I'll start with the latter, right? What folks can do is you can contact your local representatives, within your congressional districts. And
live in Montgomery County is Jamie Raskin.
Yep. and implore them to understand that counseling, not criminalization, is another tool and option to actually resource the elements that we know are helpful to Black and brown students and the alternatives to law enforcement in schools and to criminalizing them. I think that's first and foremost. I think the second thing that, you know, folks listening can do is start to have the conversations in your community and start organizing around those that have been impacted by exclusionary discipline policy. So whether that's suspensions, expulsions, referrals to family court, which puts, you know, families in a bind because of the ticketing and fines and fees that are associated with that, referrals to truancy court, right? It's like you want students to be in school, then when they miss school, your response is to keep them away from school, but you're coming at them for not being in school in the first place. Make it make sense, right? And I think those are important things to talk about, but also talk amongst yourselves about what it means to truly have a safe, inclusive school environment, right? Devoid of law enforcement and alternatives to the things that we know are helpful. It's the, you know, and I think the last thing is to really be clear with your representatives, whether it's a state and local legislators, city council folks, or those at the federal level, about what it is you experience and what needs to happen in terms of implementation to move away from really decriminalizing, you know, minor student misbehavior in schools, because that is where we are and that is where we need to be. Because we know that in white suburban schools and communities, when they talk about law enforcement, they have an interesting perspective because their students and youth are not dehumanized in the same way as Black and brown students. And so they look at safety as, well, we may have an SRO in the school, a school resource officer, or we may not. The majority of them don't. And when an incident happens, the first thing that they, you know, the first tool that they use is mental health counseling, peer-to-peer mediation, making sure that we are connecting with the family, with the, you know, the school board, the teachers, and the community to figure out what supports we need to have in place to help students and youth in our school be more productive and not engage in misbehavior. But for Black and brown students, it's a completely different story. What happens to them is we need to punish them. We need to use the full amount of the force that we have, whether that's through mechanical restraints, using handcuffs or zip ties, chemical restraints, whether it's pepper spray, mace, corporal punishment.
And this goes on in our schools. I want people to really sit with this. If you're watching this, what he's describing actually happens in schools across this country.
Right. This isn't pie in the sky. Corporal punishment, which is still legal in 19 states. How? I don't know and don't understand, particularly in the South and the rural South, where they can actually paddle, spank, use a belt if your child is misbehaving in class or in school or being insubordinate.
Got me messed up.
Not listening.
Not touch my child.
Listen, Caesar, you gotta get me off track, and you know, I hope that I never have to encounter a day where some teacher and adult has put their hands on my child.
Hold on, you remember the Kings of Comedies? We wish.
Listen, I am. There are a lot of things that I am, and I am very clear with folks when it comes to this issue, and when it comes to school discipline, that no child should be subjected to the harm, violence, and brutality of an adult, right? We always put the onus on students, youth, and children to be better, do better, and be mature, but the adults in these spaces and in the schools continue to act in ways that are, immature and beneath, the sanctity of what schools should be and what learning environment should be. And we should be really, really clear about what that should look like. And I think a lot of that comes down to accountability. But let me go back to where Zakiya was taking us. And I think with that first question, in terms of the battles that we have, encountered, it's really a lack of education around this issue. And it is also, a lot of folks who at the federal level, members, and it's not just white Republicans, white supremacists. There are a lot of folks within, the Democratic Party who are also Black that continue to think that punishment and sort of law and order is the only way to approach how you deal with minor school-based misbehavior, or how you deal with the student that may be having a bad day. And I think secondarily, the other challenge we face is that they continue to try to decouple these issues from one another. We understand that they're intersectional, right? So when we talk about counseling, not criminalization, or police-free schools, it's not just the physical removal of law enforcement from schools. It's also how schools interact with law enforcement. And it's not just how they interact with law enforcement, but what roles law enforcement play within those schools, right? Which is why when we talk about CNC, it's not just on that bill, it's a suite of bills, right? So it includes the Keeping All Students Safe in Schools Act, which is also known as CASA, which would eliminate corporal punishment, which would eliminate seclusion and restraint, particularly for students with disabilities. And then there's the Protecting Our Students in Schools Act, which eliminates corporal punishment. So, we sometimes have to face members and staffers who say, well, we aren't for police-free schools, but we're for ending seclusion and restraint, and we're for ending corporal punishment. And the education that has to be brought upon them is, you can't end corporal punishment and seclusion and restraint if you don't have police-free schools. Because to end just those two and keep police in schools, you're essentially allowing the use of seclusion and restraint and corporal punishment, because law enforcement officers will still be able to do that while they're in schools. And you can't just take out law enforcement officers and not address seclusion and restraints or corporal punishment, because the same impacts of the violence, brutality, harm, and trauma that law enforcement officers are putting on students and youth of color and students with disabilities through, again, zip tying, hog tying with handcuffs, mechanical restraints, chemical restraints, whipping them or slamming them on their head, they're still experiencing those types of corporal punishment and seclusion and restraints, or physically secluding them with their pure raw strength, or putting them in closets for hours on end to try to calm them down or subdue them is also problematic. And so you can't do one without the other, and those three elements really can't be divorced. Otherwise, you're just putting lipstick on a pig and calling it something that's pretty when it's not. It's still racist, it's still prejudiced, it's still problematic, and it's still harming our Black and brown students, youth, and children, particularly those students with disabilities.
That is so true. And I'm glad you pointed that out about young people with disabilities. That's absolutely true, because I know in our work in Dayton, when we were still doing that work specifically in Dayton, the 3 indicators for the most suspended student was Black, male, and had a disability. That was the most suspended students in Dayton Public Schools. And I'm sad to say that if we went to check the data today, right, it would still be the same. And it's truly unfortunate. I want to shift gears here to another question, and this one is about the End School Pushout Act. So could you also talk about that? When it was introduced, the punitive push out of girls of color in schools, and the disrupt the school to confinement pathway.
Yeah, so Ending School Pushout Act, it was introduced a couple of congressional sessions ago, I believe in 116th.
That's Ayanna Presley's bill, right?
Yeah, 115th, and it's Ayanna Presley's bill. She is the author of it, Democrat from Massachusetts. And at the time, that bill was really centered around codifying the Department of Education civil rights data collection, which collected data from all the schools and districts in the U.S. to see if there was racial disproportionality with respects to how the administration of school discipline was being doled out in schools and districts. They also collected data and information around the Individuals with Disabilities in Education Act for students who had disabilities and who also were on IEPs. It looked at a number of data elements and points around suspensions, expulsions, arrest, school time, etc. And so Ending School Pushout Act at the time was really introduced to articulate the plight of African American girls, i.e., Black girls in schools, because they were being pushed out for a number of different reasons, right? So having attitude, being too aggressive or being deemed as aggressive, their hairstyles, their dress, and just how they carried themselves from a cultural perspective. So think about, for those who don't know or may not be familiar with it, the Jim Crow laws of the South, where you looked at Black women who were, who had prominent features or wore their hair in a natural way or dressed a certain way as being hypersexualized or adultified in ways where they had to be punished by being lynched, being raped, being brutally beaten, etc. And so what we are seeing is that play out in our schools, not explicitly in the way where well, let me take that back, because it does happen. It does happen where Black girls are showing up to school and they get sexually assaulted by adults, where they are beaten or they are sexually harassed or by adults in the school, be it educators, administrators, etc. And so this bill was really meant to shed a light on that, but also shed a light on the ways in which that Black girls become criminalized and pushed out of school for just being Black. There's no other way to put it. Just for being Black and showing up in their authentic selves in ways where, if their hair were locked up like mine, they may get sent home because it's a dress code violation. If they wore stockings over shorts or something, they may get sent home for having a dress that is, doesn't conform with, where the school is in terms of, putting your hands down to your side and making sure that it's 2 inches below your fingers. It may be right at your fingertips and they're like, you have to go. And so that bill was meant to address that, meant to highlight and shed, what Black girls go through, and particularly also Black girls with disabilities, because at the time you had a number of folks that were raising the profile of, students with disabilities, although they were only focusing on white students with disabilities and not bringing in the intersection of race and disabilities. And you had the whole conversations around Black men and boys and boys and men of color with respects to how they were getting processed through the school to prison pipeline, whether it's through the My Brother's Keeper, the Campaign for Black Male Achievement, or through the White House Initiative on Educational Excellence for African Americans. And I'm familiar with all those because I played an integral part in helping to, define and do that work. But for Black girls, there was this gap in terms of, well, how do we raise awareness and education on what they have to deal with and all the nonsense that they have to put up with just for being Black? And so that bill did that. It also purported to define what the adultification was and really call out the sort of racism that was in play. And it also made a unique attempt to strengthen the civil rights data collection to make sure that Department of Education was collecting those data elements in ways that could be used to have interventions and implement policy and practices that would stop the push out of Black girls. And so where it is now, it's been introduced for the 117th Congress, which is the Congress that started January 2021 and will continue until December 2022. We've been in contact with Rep. Presley's office, whom we have a great relationship with, and Fed SDC, but are also working with the National Women's Law Center, who's been working lockstep with Monique Morris, whom this bill was really crafted off of the book that she wrote. And so there's some elements that Yep. And there's some elements that need to be strengthened, and we're in the process of working on that at the federal level to make sure that that bill is in alignment with, Counseling Not Criminalization, the Keeping All Students in School Safe Act, and the Protecting Our Students in School Safe Act, because these are a suite of bills and have to be addressed as such. You can't just pick and choose based on your political preference or or the need to have political access which one you want. You have to do all of them because they're so intersectional and so interrelated to one another that you can't just do one. So
no, I really appreciate that. And this has been really good because I feel like you've explained sort of, what's happening, what people can do, and definitely why it's important and why people should be supporting this, especially since a lot of folks have been working at their state level so much unsuccessfully, right? And the fact that, Black and brown folks definitely deserve to have issues that they care about prioritized by this administration and this Congress. Um, and that's probably a whole nother live we could talk about. We could talk about that. Don't even get
Listen,
me
don't
started.
don't you get me in trouble now.
Oh man,
I
listen.
will say that I think, I think across the board there's a level of frustration and
Mhm.
disappointment with this administration, for a variety of reasons. But I think
Yeah.
the most important being is that we need folks to have active listening ears
Right.
and be active listening,
Right.
because the requests and the demands have been made by the community, by the Black and brown community.
Right.
And it is not enough to continue along the lines of incrementalization,
Oh.
um, and continuing to say that we need more time. Our
Mm-mm.
students and youth and children are dying. They are being victimized, brutalized, and traumatized in a number of different ways. And we have to do better, and be held accountable, um, for the actions of the adults, and to shift policy in ways that's going to make sure that they are protected, their civil rights are protected, and that they actually are in, schools and environments where their needs are being met, whether it's academic, behavioral, from a mental health perspective, from a family engagement perspective. All of
Mhm.
that has to be true. And we can't continue to sit by in silence and play politics without addressing that, and without making a real commitment, not in a short sighted way, but in a long term, sustainable way, to make sure that we're building the next generation of folks that are going to be helpful in protecting and providing the educational access and having educational equity for Black and brown students, students with disabilities, and students that are LGBTQ plus.
Right. That's a fact. Any other legislative updates that parents and community members should know about and should be supporting?
So I think there are, the bipartisan infrastructure bill. I know, at some point, Fed SDC is going to be doing a number of town halls on all these bills, right? And then a bigger town hall on the suite of bills. But I also think the infrastructure bill and the Building Back Better bills are important because they have some educational equity and educational access pieces in it, in terms
Okay.
of funding mechanisms and resources that could be helpful. Here's the
Okay.
kicker though. It's
Mm-hmm.
all about implementation and then oversight of those dollars, right?
Ah.
One of the things that we have to be mindful of, and which is why we do the work that we do, is to make sure that having a connection and relationship with the community, we know how typically it's implemented, and how, those federal agencies are going to be doing their grant making or funding for the programming,
Mm-hmm.
knowing that we are able to make sure that we bring community folks, local organizations, local activists to the table to actually influence how those dollars can be implemented, in schools. And to the extent that they won't listen, it then becomes a strategic communications conversation and an organizing conversation around what needs to happen and how we need to go about it, in terms of pushing them and holding them accountable for not doing it. Because you can't say on one hand you're for racial equity and this is going to help, build Black and brown communities, as well as bring along the middle class, when in fact, when it comes to the implementation, you're only focused on the middle class and you do nothing for Black and brown communities. And so
Mm.
understanding that we're in a position to be able to be helpful to the communities on the ground and make sure they have a seat at the table. And we also, pride ourselves in terms of standing in solidarity with them to hold the elected officials and members accountable, around these policy pieces, and actually getting language in that is helpful to the communities, not based in some academic theory of change that will be,
Talk about it.
ill representative of Black and brown communities and not do what many folks purport to say that they are doing, which is
Right.
protecting Black and brown communities, liberating them, and getting them out of poverty and giving them better access to resources,
We
support,
wish.
et cetera. And so that's really where we are. And I think the more we can do to continue having conversations like this, getting pushback and challenges from the community and being held accountable by them, I think the better off we'll be. And I think the last piece is just the public education around this. I can't tell you, when we go into the member offices and have these conversations, the level of candor that we are met with once we get out of this sort of and just give it to them raw, real, and candidly, it's amazing. People don't know what they don't know, and they rely
Right.
on stereotypes and conventional wisdoms and assumptions that don't do them any justice. And so if they're only hearing from a faction of people or those that they are closest to that aren't on the ground, they're making policy decisions based on that and not anything else. And I think that's the role that we all have to play if we want to collectively liberate around police-free schools and have a better life for Black and brown individuals that have been directly impacted, improve Black and brown communities, and make sure that Black, brown students, youth, children are in schools, have access to safe school environments, and are growing in ways that are going to see them as assets and see their humanity for what it actually is, rather than dehumanizing them and harming them in all the ways that we continue to do.
Right. Chris, this has been so informative, even for me, because I've missed a few of the coalition meetings. But in terms of those, town halls that's being organized or anything else, feel free to hit me separately if you feel like I can be supportive in any of that. I think you have my cell. If you don't, just But yeah, text me and say, hey, Zakiya, are you available for this or whatever, any way I can help. And then also I'm rooted in community here in Montgomery County. So I'm connected to a bunch of different activist groups here who would be ready to mobilize around something like this with the quickness. So definitely see me as a resource.
Will do. It's one of the conversations, that we had yesterday. And I have to, explain to folks and remind folks that I don't come to this work for a paycheck or for a glam or for glitz or for power or
this is hard work.
Yeah, this is me because, I'm a Black man and I have Black kids, and
that's right.
I'm born and raised in Florida from Pine Hills, aka Crime Hills. And so
wow,
this stuff does, and what I see, I'm privileged to sit in the spaces that I sit in because I shouldn't be here, right? I shouldn't have made it out of my environment. I should not be as, well versed and as educated as so many people assume that I'm not, but I am. And so understanding what that world looks like and that all my family is still back there and how these policies impact them, this is for them and the many folks that are impacted and come from Black and brown communities where many of the folks making decisions about it have never stepped foot in those communities. And if they have,
they don't have the same lived experiences.
Right. And if they have, they've forgotten from which they come. And we should just be clear about that. And so I'm not here to placate or do a disservice to my community, because to do that, which, it would essentially mean for me that I'm destroying myself, because I see myself as a pillar of hope for my community and for those that I know sacrificed to get me into the place that I'm at now. And so I have to give back. And this is just my way of giving back and being very unapologetic about it. And so when we have these conversations, I think there is no no in this work for me.
Right.
There is no, we're not going to do that. If I have to sacrifice and it costs me everything, and that means that we can organize and we can be aggressive and we can be helpful and we can make sure that another Black and brown student is not going to be impacted or hurt today, then I'm with it. There's no reason to not be with it and be for the cause. And so I hope that folks understand, when we talk about these issues, it can't just be a rite of passage, and it can't be for the sole purposes of having access or being close to those in power and with influence, because nine times out of 10, those folks don't even have the power and influence that they purport and say that they have.
Ain't
And
that the
so,
truth?
we have to be true and be accountable to organizations, students, parents, those directly impacted, and make sure that we are building power and capacity for them to change and make a difference. I can get a meeting anytime, but it's not, but it gives me all the joy in the world to know that I can call a meeting and get a parent or a youth or a directly impacted individual a meeting with their representative in ways that they couldn't, so that they could have their voice heard and they could actually pull up and have an impact and educate the folks who claim to know all but actually don't know when it comes to Black and brown issues, but make all the decisions. And so that's not equity. And so we have to flip that on its head, whether it's on education policy, whether it's on policing, whether it's on reentry, whether it's on economic justice, or even climate justice. We just have to be clear and unapologetic about how all those pieces intersect with one another, and how we are not here to sort of play games or run from the same blueprint around these issues.
Right. Well, you are doing an amazing job. We appreciate you. Definitely appreciate you convening the Federal School Discipline Coalition. I actually think we should have been convened even during the last administration, to be honest, because I feel like just because he was crazy, the law is still the law. The civil rights law is still the civil rights law, and we should have been pushing, regardless. But I know, like, that was, totally different.
It wasn't for because of who was in office or lack of. There were some political mountains that had to be moved, and you also gave grace to some of the other folks that were doing the work. But I think, after January 6th and the passing of, Allison Brown, it kind of kicked a number of things into gear where we couldn't wait. We couldn't be,
that's right,
the same passive and or doing the same, running from the same strategy. We had to be aggressive, bolder, and honestly, just real with folks about what this work is, what it needs to be, and how it's going to move forward, period, point blank.
Yeah. No, I appreciate that, and love my sister Allison Brown. That was, that hurt, but she fought, and she fought a good fight. Thank you for mentioning her name for sure. Chris, this has been great. You're always welcome back on this platform. Let me know, because if there's more bills coming, or like there's something else that we need to be talking about, just let me know and I can set it up. But thank you, brother. I really appreciate you. Appreciate all the good work that you're doing over at Open Society. And thank you, and keep going.
Will do. Thank you for having me. And I'll definitely take you up on that, because I can think about two other people that, the three of us are kind of like a mini, tag team.
That's right. Email me. Yeah. Email
me. Probably set some people's hair on fire.
Let's do it. I'm always down. See ya.
Thanks.